The wind shrieked against the stone walls of the Blackwood Point Lighthouse, a sound Silas had grown accustomed to over 30 years, though it never failed to sound like the dying breath of something ancient. The lighthouse stood on a jagged promontory of basalt, severed from the mainland during high tide, casting its pale beam out into the abyssal stretch of the Atlantic. It was an old structure, older than the records in the nearby village suggested. The foundation stones were uneven, and the iron stairs that spiraled up its belly groaned with a sort of weary sentience. Silas was a man of few words and fewer companions. His isolation was not a punishment but a choice, a retreat from a world that had moved on without him. His days were measured not by hours, but by the meticulous routine of maintenance, polishing the brass, oiling the gears, and keeping the great Fresnel lens free of salt spray. The lens was a marvel of late 19th century engineering, a massive beehive of prismatic glass designed to catch and magnify the light of the central lamp. But tonight was different. The barometer had been plunging steadily since morning, and the sea had turned the color of bruised iron. A nor'easter was brewing, one that the radio crackled with urgent warnings about before dying completely. Silas didn't mind the storms. They were a reminder of the raw power of the world, a power he respected and feared in equal measure. He climbed the final steps to the lantern room, a heavy brass bucket of oil in hand. The air up here was always cold, biting through his thick wool sweater. He set the bucket down and approached the lens. As he reached out with a rag to polish a particularly stubborn smudge, his hand paused. The brass framework that held the prisms together was etched with faint, intricate lines. He had seen them countless times before, dismissing them as decorative flourishes of the original craftsman. But in the dim light of the oncoming storm, the lines seemed to catch the shadows differently, forming coherent shapes. Silas leaned in, his breath fogging the glass. He wiped it away with his sleeve and squinted. They were symbols, not mere decorations. Swirling geometries that hurt the eye to look at for two long, intersecting lines that seemed to imply more dimensions than the mind could comfortably comprehend. He traced one with a calloused finger. It felt cold, colder than the surrounding metal. He had always considered himself a practical man, a man of nuts and bolts, oil and glass. But isolation breeds its own kind of madness, a vulnerability to the unseen. The longer he stared at the symbols, the more they seemed to pulse, a slow, rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of his own heart. He remembered the old logs he had found in the basement years ago, brittle pages filled with the rambling entries of previous keepers. Most were mundane accounts of weather and fuel consumption, but a few spoke of the watchers in the deep and the necessary pacts. He had dismissed them as the ramblings of men driven mad by the solitude and the ceaseless roar of the ocean. Now, staring at the occult geometry etched into the very heart of the lighthouse, he wasn't so sure. The storm hit with a ferocity that shook the massive stone tower to its foundations. Rain lashed against the lantern room windows like handfuls of gravel. Silas moved methodically, filling the lamp, trimming the wick, and igniting the light. The great lens began its slow, majestic rotation, sending a beam of brilliant white light slicing through the darkness and the driving rain. But as the light swept over the churning sea, Silas noticed something wrong. The beam didn't just illuminate the waves, it seemed to agitate them. Where the light touched the water, the surface boiled, churning with an unnatural frenzy. He grabbed his binoculars and pressed them to his eyes, scanning the water where the beam fell. For a long moment, he saw nothing but the chaotic dance of the storm. Then, as the beam swung back, he caught a glimpse of something enormous breaking the surface. It was dark, a slick, glistening black that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It possessed a bulk that defied reason, an architecture of flesh and scale that belonged to an age long before humanity. Silas stumbled back, dropping the binoculars. They clattered against the iron grating of the floor. His heart hammered against his ribs. He rushed to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. The creature was rising, hauling itself up the jagged rocks of the promontory. It had no discernible shape, just a chaotic mass of appendages and a single, unblinking eye that glowed with a sickly, luminescent green. The wind howled louder, a sound that was no longer just air moving over stone, but a chorus of voices, ancient and hungry. They seemed to echo from the very walls of the lighthouse, a low, guttural chant that vibrated in Silas's teeth. The symbols on the brass framework of the lens began to glow, a faint, sickly luminescence that matched the eye of the creature on the rocks. He understood then with a terrifying clarity. The lighthouse was not a warning to ships. It was a ward. The light, magnified by the intricate, occult geometry of the lens, was the only thing keeping the creature at bay, and the creature knew it. It was ascending the rocks slowly, methodically, its massive bulk protesting against gravity. The light swept over it again, and it let out a sound that shattered the glass of one of the lantern room windows. Silas covered his ears, dropping to his knees. The sound was not a roar but a complex, multi-layered frequency that tore at his sanity. The light flickered. Silas looked up in horror. The central lamp was sputtering, the flame dancing erratically. He scrambled to his feet and rushed to the lamp. The oil reservoir was nearly empty, though he had just filled it. He checked the valve. It was secure. There was no leak, but the oil was simply disappearing as if consumed by an unseen hunger. He grabbed the heavy brass bucket and poured the remaining oil into the reservoir. The flame stabilized for a moment, then began to gutter again. The light dimmed, the beam growing weak and anemic. The creature on the rocks let out another sound, a sound of triumph. It hauled itself higher, its massive bulk obscuring the base of the lighthouse. Silas could feel the stone vibrating under his feet. He frantically searched the lantern room for anything else that would burn. He found a pile of old rags, heavily soaked in oil, and threw them onto the lamp. The flame flared, a bright, angry orange that sent thick black smoke filling the room. It was not enough. The symbols on the brass framework pulsed brighter, a desperate, frantic rhythm. The voices in the wind grew louder, demanding, insistent. They were not chanting a spell, they were chanting a price. Silas remembered the old logs, the cryptic references to the necessary pacts. He understood now what the previous keepers had known, what they had sacrificed to keep the ward intact. The light was not fueled by oil alone. It required something more profound, something vital. The creature was almost at the top of the tower now. Its massive bulk blotted out the storm, casting the lantern room into an unnatural darkness. A single, enormous appendage, slick with sea slime and lined with jagged, chitinous hooks, slammed against the remaining glass of the windows. The glass shattered, raining down on Silas like deadly hail. The wind tore into the room, extinguishing the lamp completely. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the roar of the storm. In the darkness, the glowing green eye of the creature appeared in the shattered window frame, huge and unblinking. It stared at Silas with an ancient, unfathomable intelligence, an intelligence that recognized him not as an enemy, but as a key. The symbols on the brass framework flared one last time, a blinding, actinic light that etched itself into Silas's retinas. And in that brief flash, he saw the true nature of the pact. He didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He picked up a jagged shard of glass from the floor, its edge razor-sharp. He didn't think about the pain, or the cold, or the long, lonely years he had spent in the lighthouse. He thought only of the light, the ward, and the terrifying necessity of keeping the ancient hunger at bay. He stepped towards the center of the room, towards the unlit lamp and the pulsing, glowing symbols of the lens. The creature let out a low, satisfied rumble, its appendage reaching out, filling the room with the stench of brine and rotting Ians. Silas brought the shard of glass down across his palm. The blood welled up immediately, dark and warm. He pressed his bleeding hand against the central pillar of the lamp, exactly where the symbols were most densely clustered. The reaction was instantaneous. The blood didn't just stain the brass, it was absorbed, drawn into the intricate lines of the occult geometry. The symbols flared again, this time not with a sickly green light, but with a brilliant, searing white. The central lamp ignited with a roar, not a flame of oil, but a pillar of pure, blinding light. The great lens magnified it, focusing the beam directly into the massive, unblinking eye of the creature. The sound the creature made this time was one of unadulterated agony. It recoiled, its massive bulk thrashing against the side of the lighthouse, sending shockwaves through the stone. It tore itself away from the shattered window, plummeting back down towards the churning sea. The light blazed on, brighter than it had ever been, casting long, stark shadows across the lantern room. Silas sank to his knees, clutching his bleeding hand. The wind still howled and the storm still raged, but the voices were gone. He stayed there for a long time, watching the beam sweep out into the darkness, a solitary guardian against the abyss. He knew the creature would return. He knew the ward would need to be renewed. The isolation was no longer just a choice, it was a sentence. But as he looked at the blood drying on the brass and the brilliant, unyielding light of the lens, Silas felt a strange, cold comfort. He was a man of maintenance, a keeper of the light. And the light, he now understood, was the only thing standing between the world and the dark.